Okay guys, we're going to get started with our meeting of Game Dev Club. Today, we're going to be looking at the Unity API. Now, what is an API? An API, it contains basically a bunch of information about different functions and different objects we can use to make our games. Because the good people at Unity, they made a bunch of functions they already pre-made a bunch of functions that we can use to do a lot of cool things. Now, I'm going to be using the transform API sort of as an example. Now, there's a few different types of classes, I'll call them. This one, we're going to be looking at a class with that has the same name as, say, a component, in this case transform. Now the transform component, you're going to have it in basically every game object you create. So this is a good starting point to look at. As you can see, it has a transform. Now, well, first, a little bit about the transform. Basically, it just stores information about, if we look at the component, about the position, rotation, scale, and generally just where the game object is. Now, and this is reflected in the transform API in its properties and its methods. Now, properties are just a fancy way of saying variables, which are contained within the transform class, and methods is just functions. Now, first of all, how do we access the transform component? Well, to do that, we're going to want to do get component, which is here. We're going to want to put these triangle brackets, and we're going to want to type in the name of the component we want, in this case, transform, which should autocomplete here. And put some parentheses there. And of course, end it with a semicolon. Now basically what this line of code is telling the computer is that we're about to do something with the transform component. It should be noted that in order to do this, you want the script that you're doing this in to be attached to something with a transform, otherwise, or whatever component you're using. Just transform happens to be on basically all game objects. Now, what can we do with the transform? Well, first of all, looking at an API in general, again, we have at the top, we have the name of it, and we have a short description, which will tell us roughly what we can do with it. And you also usually have an example right here of things you can do with the transform. Now let's look at the properties section. The properties section, as I said, contains a lot of variables specific to the transform component in this case. Let's look at a simple one, which is position. Now, position, if we click on it, as you might imagine, it's a variable that stores the position of whatever thing is attached to the transform. And now from last lesson, you might remember that we can store a few different types of variables. We have things like ints, doubles, booleans, floats. But to store a position, you usually tend to think of position in terms of x, y, and z, right? So that's 3 numbers. How do we store 3 numbers in one variable? Well, in this case, it's using a special object called a vector3, which for the purposes of right now, we'll go into vectors later on, but right now, all you need to know is a vector3 holds 3 numbers, floats to be specific. It'll hold an x, a y, and a z, and that's why here the transform, the position variable, is storing a vector3. Now, if we look down here, we get again a short description of it and an example. And obviously for position, it's a pretty simple thing. But once you start looking at more advanced or more weird-looking variables and functions, the examples are actually really helpful. So I encourage you to look at these if you're confused about anything. Now, how do we use that position? We know we have a variable called position in the transform component. How do we use this in code? Well, to get the position, we're just keeping in mind that this is a variable. We're just gonna access it by doing dot position, and again, as you can see, autocomplete just goes there, which means we're doing something right. Okay, now we have position. It is showing us that a red line. That's because right now this is just, it's basically just a number, a vector 3 here randomly. We're not doing anything with it right now, but let's say you wanted to like print it, which is something we can do. Now the red lines are gone, and if we were to run this, but first I think I have to attach this component to something. Let's attach it to the camera, because why not? Let's see. Drag it over to attach it. Let me try again. Okay, now we have the script attached over to the camera. Let's switch over to the console and run the game. There is no ridge button. It looks like I have a problem here. Here it's trying to get a component which isn't attached to the camera. So you saw it gave us an error when we tried to access a component that wasn't on the camera, in this case it's rigid body. So let me just comment this out. Save again. All compiler errors. Yes. Comment this out because it was referring to a variable that didn't exist. And now if we run it, well, as soon as I pause it, we can see we get here the 3 numbers which correspond to the X, Y, and Z of the camera. So now we've accessed a variable from the position component over here in code. Now there's a lot of other variables here which you can look at for the transform, but let's move on to public methods. Now, public just means that you can use it, and methods, that's just another way of saying a function. Now, methods, they tend to like do things, so let's look at the translate method, which, if you know math, translate, it just means you're moving something. This is a function you're going to use when you're going to want to have movement in your game. So let's see here. Here at the top right here, it shows a few different ways we can use translate. It shows us what kind of parameters we're going to need. In this case, we're going to need we can do it in 2 ways. We can either just put in a vector 3, or we can put in a vector 3 and this thing, which we can talk about a bit later. But for now, let's just use the first one since it's simpler. Now, as you can imagine, this is just going to move whatever game object it's attached to by the amounts on the vector 3, which again are 3 numbers. Here, and if you didn't know that, we could always look down here and see the description. And if you really want to know what this second value is right here, it even explains it right here in this part of the description. And again, we have an example in case you didn't know how to use the function. And here we have, what's this? It looks kind of like this part up here, except we're seeing it down here. These are even more different ways where you can call translate. Here, instead of passing a vector 3 for this part and here, we're just straight up passing in 3 floats, or 3 numbers, basically. So that's just all different ways to call translate, but they're all going to do basically the same thing, which is move your game object. Here we have more ways to call translate, more ways, and yeah. And with each one, you get a description of how it's slightly different, and an example to go along with it. But now let's see how this works. So for a function, we're going to be doing something. So let's again type get component. We're still going to need to reference the the component we're looking at specifically, which is translate or transform. And now to use a function, we're going to again type dot and write the name of the function we want. In this case, translate. And again, it should autocomplete. Now we have to pass something in, or otherwise it says we have the red lines here, which says there's an error. And what we're gonna pass in, we can use in any one of these, and they'll all be the same. But let's use this one since it's simpler, and it doesn't use vectors. So we just need to pass in 3 floats, and it'll move whatever we want by that amount. So let's say 5 F 4 and 3. I don't know. Now, in case you're wondering why we're typing F at the end, again, it's asking for 3 floats, and to make a float, you're going to want to write a number followed by just the letter F to indicate that it's a float. Now, right now this is set on the camera, but that might be a bit hard to see. So let's create a new object here, cube, and attach this script over to it. Now, let me detach this script from here, which should be just remove component. And so that you can see, I'm going to move this function over to update, and also comment this out. Now this should just move the object a certain amount. Actually, let's make this a bit slower. Okay, now if we run this, we should see the cube start moving. Just flying away from the screen. So that's how you essentially use functions here. Now there are a few more things I want to show you right here. This part that says inherited members on the API. These are just properties and methods. You can still use them the same as other properties and methods that we found up here. It just means that they were inherited from another class, which if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. And we also have this static methods section. The static methods work a little bit differently in that, specifically in this instance, we're going to, if we want to use a static method, I'm not going to run it, but instead of typing out get component dot the component we want, and then this, we can just type in the name of the class, transform dot, and then choose any of these static methods. Let's say destroy, and we can just use it like this. And destroy, it's asking for an object, so we can just if we wanted to destroy an object, we could just call the name of the class itself, which is transform dot destroy. But you're probably not going to need any static methods at the moment, so we're not going to go over that yet fully or in depth. And that's about it for this. Let's go to okay, let me show you something else because I think we have time. let's do prefabs, I guess. Okay, so what's a prefab? To think of it in terms of making a video game, let's say you're making a shooter. You want your guns are going to shoot bullets, right? A lot of bullets probably. And each of those bullets is going to be a game object, but they're all probably going to be pretty much the same or maybe slightly different. Now, how do we do that? We're not going to make one game object by clicking create game object sphere for every bullet, right? So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a prefab of it. So a prefab is basically just here. It's like a template or a copy a master copy that you use that which later maybe you're going to want to create more of, maybe you want to create less of, which as my example of the bullet, you're going to want to create a lot of those, right? And to create a prefab, we just want to take a game object from here and drag it over to this window right here. That should create a prefab. Now, what can we do with this? Well, if you want to change something about the prefab, and then we can change something about the prefab, and then every time we create a copy of it, it'll just have those changes. So let's say we want to make this bigger. As you can see, I'm changing the values in this prefab, but the game object itself that's out here is also changing as I do it. Now what we can also do is we can also, if we want some to be slightly different than others, I can go in directly here and change the scale here, let's say 9, and it won't change the prefab. So I can change the template to fit I can change the template and it'll change the individuals, but if I change the individuals, it won't change the template. So here I can drag out another one and we can see that there's a difference between them. And I think that's basically prefabs in a nutshell. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say for this lesson. So I guess you guys can just mess around with what I've shown you. I encourage you to look at the API again, because there's going to be we can't teach you like every specific thing about each specific class and what each specific method and property does, because even just like in the transform, we have a long list of things, and we can't show you what each one does individually. So I encourage you to look at the API and sort of just figure out what you can and can't do, because there's a lot of things that like you'll want to do, and maybe there's already a method out there that does exactly what you want to do. So instead of having to create your own method, you can just rely on one of these. So that's going to make coding a lot easier. And yeah, that's basically the gist of it.